I'm happy to be here today. And as you can see from the title of the presentation, I will try to keep the speech as practical as possible, and I will talk about compliance issues, so day-by-day issues that indeed data managers could face when indeed dealing with the sharing and the reusing of personal data for scientific purposes and research purposes in the health domain. Okay, I'm afraid I cannot move the slide. I cannot move my slide.
So maybe you can stop sharing and start again, maybe to help.
Exactly. Okay. I'll try sharing another. Okay, let's try this one. Okay, yeah, now it works. It should work. Okay, so let me start off saying that indeed there is a new, as we already know, actually there is this new big data paradigm that has brought a shift in the way we adopt decisions, and also in the health domain in general, and for scientific research. This new paradigm shift applies. So the use of big data analytics and AI technologies is paving the way for new great opportunities in scientific health research from many specific points of view, such as in clinical trials, in observational studies, or drug discoveries. However, the fundamental and key points of using big data and AI technologies, of course, is the necessity to use and reuse data, which is usually also personal data, according to EU legislation on personal data. And at the EU level, the European Commission is perfectly aware that in order to enhance and boost the use of big data analytics, is indeed necessary to facilitate the reuse and the share of data, especially personal data. So a new data strategy has been recently launched by the European Commission, involving indeed legislative acts in order to facilitate the sharing of such data. So, for example, the DGA is already a regulation of the European Union, and for the specific domain of health, the European Health Data Space regulation is now a proposal. So it's forthcoming as another regulation that should specify for the health domain, so for electronic health data, specify the data governance framework for this domain, with the purpose indeed to, among the others, to enhance the reuse of personal data for secondary purposes, such as indeed scientific research. However, the health domain is a much more complex much more complex area, especially from a legislative point of view. So many legislative acts apply when indeed big data and artificial intelligence technologies are applied, and at the center of it, indeed, we have the GDPR, which regulate the processing of personal data, and which interplays basically with all the other legislative acts, somehow and often not very easily, creating creating also compliance issues that is difficult to overcome. And moreover, at national level, we have another layer of compliance issues related to national provisions, additional national provisions that are introduced by member states, because GDPR leaves room for national legislator to introduce further requirements and further obligation in the specific domain of health data and scientific research in the health domain. So basically, we have a trade-off indeed between the necessity to use and reuse personal data as much as possible even for very important purposes, such as scientific research in the healthcare, in health domain, and on the other end, data protection law. That's indeed on the other end allow the personal data processing only according to some conditions, and especially in the big data and artificial intelligence domain, there are some data protection law aspects and principles that are extremely difficult to implement from a practical point of view. So, such as the purpose limitation principle, storage limitation principle, data minimization. And this is due to the fact that if on the one hand GDPR is meant to limit personal data processing to just to a specific purpose, which should be indicated before starting the data processing, and is meant to ensure that data controller process as less as that as possible and store data for the minimum amount of time. On the other hand, the big data paradigm revolves around the concept that we should process and share as much data as possible for purposes that sometimes is not possible to identify in advance, and store data as much as possible, because indeed we don't know if a data tomorrow could be useful for some unpredictable purposes. Then, moreover, from a different, slightly different perspective, there are compliance issues also related to the interplay between GDPR and the new data strategy, because it has been noted, especially by the European Data Protection Board and the European Data Protection Supervisor, that the interplay between the DGA and the European health data space is not that easy in light of with the GDPR. So it could be difficult in the future for data controller to process personal data even within the framework of the new data strategy, and especially it should be always we should be always aware that anyway the new data strategy, even though if try to incentivize and foster the sharing and the reuse of data and also personal data, the new legislative measures do not amend any principles or requirements of the GDPR. So even within the new data governance framework, deal with personal data, such data processing shall always be in compliance with GDPR. Anyway, it should be noted that the last version of the DGA has actually solved some of these problems that you can see here in these slides. But anyway, this is what has been noted by the EDPB and the EDPS from this perspective, for example. So the final question is if actually the GDPR is our elephant in GDPR, something that creates obstacle that is not possible to overcome when sharing and using data, even for research purposes. And the answer is yes and no, in my opinion. The answer is no, because at least on paper, the GDPR try to incentivize actually research. So the GDPR does not pose any restriction to research, at least on a theoretical level, because indeed, for example, there is a broad definition of research in the GDPR, which includes almost every kind of research. The GDPR allows for some flexibility in respect to many requirements when indeed personal data are processed for scientific research purposes. So, for example, it's possible to use a broader form of consent. So then there is some flexibility on the purpose limitation purpose, on the storage limitation purpose, and there is a specific legal basis for research in the medical field, for example, and also the exercise of data subject rights is facilitated for data controllers. But on the other hand, on a more practical level, we can note that we still have three problems that actually create obstacles to the reuse of data for research purposes, to the use and reuse. One category is brought by the accountability and compliance issues, and accountability because indeed the GDPR is trying to moving away from the old paradigm of the data protection directive, which was based on a consent-based approach and on an individualistic approach, and the GDPR, on the other hand, tried to adopt a risk-based approach. So it means that data protection obligations scale up according to the risk of the data processing. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends on the points of view, usually personal data processing that are carried out for scientific research in the medical field are high risk data processing. So it means that also the obligations and the requirements for data controllers are higher, because of the sensitivity of the data. So we are talking about health-related data, biometric data or genetic data most of the time. And then compliance issues are generated by, indeed, as I said before, by the lack of and the difficult interplay between GDPR, so data protection law, and other legislative domains. On the other end, we have the legal fragmentation and the national legislative issues. So some member states, for example, have introduced national laws that are not very research friendly in the data protection domain because of the room that the GDPR left to national legislator, as I said before. And that also creates some fragmentation. That, of course, is an obstacle for the sharing, the cross-border sharing of data among Europe. And so, especially if this is seen in light of a big data context, we have these practical issues. So, of course, about fragmentation issues and the national legislator provisions If we are just data controllers, we cannot do that much. But if we look at the problems from the accountability and compliance perspective, indeed we could do something. And I want to propose indeed two instruments, two compliance instruments. So instruments that should be used in order to facilitate the activity of compliance and the demonstration of compliance. They are code of conduct and certification. They are different instruments, although similar from some perspective. Indeed, they are both tools of compliance. And so, for example, this is an overview of the state of the art of approved code of conduct certification mechanism. And they are, if we look at the certification, for example, they are voluntary measures that are drafted by private stakeholders and approved by Data Protection Authority or by the EDBB itself. And they can adopt it by data controller and processor in order indeed to certify and demonstrate that they have reached out a good level of compliance. Whichever aspect of the GDPR could be certified. And here we have some examples that are explicitly mentioned in the GDPR itself. So demonstration of compliance with privacy by design and privacy by default principle, or with security requirements. So to sum up, we can use these instruments in order to find an easier way to demonstrate compliance in complex situations, such as indeed big data context for research purposes, in order to also create trust among stakeholders, operating on reputational aspects, and if the case even creates, let's say, market advantages on competitors. And especially the most important, create one of the goals is to create common way to reach compliance, so common compliance practices. However, I'm perfectly aware that to be certified represents also a cost. So to get a certification, it means spending money. But the suggestion is to see these initial investments, initial cost as an investment in compliance, because they indeed help data controller and processor reach and demonstrate high level of commitments that could generate benefit for the organizations itself that process personal data, but also for the whole environment and for data subject itself. And the final goal should be to get a return on the initial investments, which could be in practical terms also a competitive advantage or a reduction of the risk to be fined, for example, from the Data Protection Authority. So I will conclude just presenting two certification schemes. The first one is EuroPrivacy. This is the first EU-wide certification scheme. It has been approved recently by the European Data Protection Board. It is interesting because it's EU-wide and it covers the whole GDPR. On the other hand, another interesting example could be EDIS, which is an information governance and data privacy for health ICT system certification. It means that this certification, for example, focuses especially on health data processing. So it is especially it has been taught especially for the health domain, and it could be used by different stakeholders, from data providers to data facilitators and even data users. Yeah, this is just the last slide about EDs. If you are interested, you can find more information on the website. And that's basically everything for me. So thank you.
So I decided to narrow it down this presentation that was meant to be on broadly cybersecurity, on cyber hygiene, so-called cyber hygiene good practices, which is oftentimes a neglected concept in both commentators' areas or perhaps even practitioners' areas. So without further ado, I will just start with presenting. It seems that I have the same issue. Oh, no, okay. It works. So I'd like to start with more somewhat disruptive slide, which takes into account the costs of cyber attacks and, in general, poor cybersecurity. So, with, of course, COVID-19 pandemics, nearly every sector of the single market moved online, moved digital, irrespective of the increasing digitization of society. And of course, that brought threats. So, of course, depending on different data that are processed by, for example, a research facility, the attacker's motivations and the fall threats change, as do change the impacts. There may be reputational, economic, but even physical. So cybersecurity always, always, it may and it will increasingly entail a degree of safety considerations to take on. So the last ENISA threat landscape, which has been published a few days ago, considered that the education sector amounted to almost 2% of total number of incidents in EU in the estimated time, which was 2021. So in general, to give you some numbers, cyber attacks can cost to the European Union nearly 41 million euros per year. So, as I said, the world in general is, of course, digitizing. Number of high-profile cyber attacks keeps on increasing, both in terms of quality and quantity. And so this is an estimation of the cost of cyber attacks worldwide, which is crazy amount of money. Yeah, so an important aspect that we shall keep in mind is that a cybersecurity incident, for example, in a product or in a system, let's say in a process, can affect an entire organization or a whole supply chain as they often propagate across borders of the market, of sectors in minutes. So, from a regulatory perspective, the so-called EU cybersecurity law is a fast-evolving area. So the European legal framework, comprises several pieces of mainly horizontal legislation that covers certain aspects linked to cybersecurity from different angles. Yet, so this journey, let's say, started in 2013, but it's only in 2016 that EU equipped itself with the so-called NIS directive, the first piece of EU-wide legislation on cybersecurity. Then in 2019, the Cybersecurity Act aimed at enhancing the security of products by introducing a certification framework similar to what Francesco told us before in the area of data protection law. And then 2020 was the watershed, so to speak, as the Commission presented its a new cybersecurity strategy for the digital decade. The NIS2 directive proposal was presented in couple with the strategy, and then we finish this timeline with the Cyber Resilience Act proposal, which is on a high level horizontal cybersecurity regulation for products with digital elements. So basically, any software hardware product. So I will now say a few words on the four most important, let's say, cornerstone legal acts, European legal acts on cybersecurity. These are the NIS2, Cybersecurity Act, and Cyber Resilience Act. Before moving on to the specific concept and domain of cyber hygiene and how cyber hygiene is conceived by EU legislation. So the NIS directive was adopted in 2016 as the GDPR, but it's less famous, let's say, lays down measures to achieve a high common level of security of network and information systems. So in scope, sorry about that. In scope of the NIS fall operators of essential services, which had to be identified by the member states, and digital service providers, which are identified by the directive itself. Of course, the main pillars of the directive are the security measures and notification duties for the NIS actors, but the directive did not enter into detailing, for example, the measures that the entities had to take in order to prevent and mitigate the risk. It was left up to them. The NIS2 is a game changer in this sense. It will apply to public and private essential and important entities, so much more entities in scope. The very narrow scope of the NIS one has been criticized a lot. And so yeah, also NIS2 will strengthen in detail compared to the previous version, cybersecurity measures, requirements, in particular addressing the security of supply chains. And it will streamline reporting obligations. Finally, the legislator envisaged more stringent, more strict supervisory and enforcement mechanisms, including a set of harmonized sanctions at EU level. So the Cybersecurity Act, adopted in 2019, defines cybersecurity, sorry, for the first time in a EU legal text, as the activities necessary to protect network and information systems, users of such systems, and other persons affected by cyber threats. So, as you may see, the definition is rather broad, and it encompasses a lot more than traditional scope of information security. The Cybersecurity Act has mainly two souls, two parts. The first one strengthens the ENISA mandate by granting it a permanent one. And the second one establishes, as I said, the European Cybersecurity Certification Legal Framework, which is voluntary, and it should serve a twofold purpose. So increase trust in products, services, and processes. Sorry. And secondly, avoid the multiplication of conflicting or overlapping schemes. So finally, the Cyber Resilience Act, which has been presented roughly 1 month ago, would complement the cybersecurity law, European cybersecurity law, by laying down horizontal cybersecurity requirements for all products with digital elements. And it will build on the principles and normative architectures of the new legislative framework, which is basically the directives and regulation on EU product safety. So, coming now on the second part of this presentation, which is mainly focused on cyber hygiene policies and practices. I will start by trying to define what is somewhat difficult to define because many actors among sectors have their own definition in mind. So it for sure plays a critical role across the European Union in protecting businesses, but it also provides the foundations for protecting infrastructure and underlying data. So as you can see on an ENISA report back to 2016, cyber hygiene should be viewed in the same manner as personal hygiene. And once properly integrated into an organization, will be simply daily routines, good behaviors, occasional checkups to make sure the organization online health is in optimum condition. So 6 years ago, actually, ENISA highlighted that most respondents to these surveys perceived cyber hygiene programs and practices as yet a good idea on paper, but quite low priority, as there was no an external need to comply. It wasn't hard law. So the key takeaway from the report of ENISA 2016 was the need of standard approach to cyber hygiene across all the EU. So against this background, ENISA, after adoption of the Cyber Security Act, which again strengthens its mandate, and the new cybersecurity strategy, so supports the enhancement of cybersecurity skills and competence across Europe at all levels, from non-expert to highly skilled professionals. And as one task that the agency has is to raise citizens in general awareness on cybersecurity and potential cyber threats through, for example, annual threat landscape reports, also providing guidance on good practices to promote safer online behavior. And that is where cyber hygiene comes into the game. So the main question now is, are these cyber hygiene practices a legal obligation? Well, before the NIS2, no. It was a simple no answer. In the Commission proposal of 2020, you could not find the term cyber hygiene whatsoever. But in recital, specifically recital 45, you could find this cybersecurity policies and follows good practices, which somewhat links to what we have described as cyber hygiene. But what's interesting is that in the consolidated text after the political agreement of the co-legislators, the Parliament and the Council of the European Union, cyber hygiene is taken into account very seriously and more often through the legal text. In particular, at the very beginning of the consolidated text of the NIS2 directive, member states will have to adopt in their cybersecurity high-level strategies policies on promoting and developing cybersecurity education and training, awareness raising, as well as guidance on good cyber hygiene prevention practices and controls. And these are aimed at society in general, like citizens, stakeholders, businesses. And secondly, member states again shall adopt a policy to strengthen the cyber resilience and cyber hygiene baseline of SMEs. So I put also these two other recitals because it's interesting, especially with regard to recital 45B, to see how the institutions, the co-legislators, try to break it down these practices to, facilitate the tasks of the economic operators, for example, or anyway, those who have to comply with the directive. So, for example, these practices imply zero trust principles, software updates, device configuration, segmentation, and so on and so forth. Finally, ENISA, and this somewhat links to the announced role of ENISA and the central role of ENISA vis-a-vis this this awareness and cyber hygiene practices that stakeholders will have increasingly have to take into account, will issue in cooperation and close cooperation with the Commission and the cooperation group established by the NIS directive. The annual report on the state of cybersecurity in the Union, which, among the other things, has to include an assessment of the general level of cybersecurity awareness and hygiene, both among citizens and entities. So it will include eventually also research facilities. So on the website of the ENISA, of course, you can find accessible several reports, such as the one I cited before of 2016. And of course, here there is also a video, a very quick one of 2 minutes on cyber hygiene that was prepared by ENISA in the last month, actually, so super recent. And yeah, maybe we can skip that. If you're curious, then you can find it in the slide or in the website. And yeah, that's all from me.
My presentation is on the evaluation of different consent models for the processing of health data for scientific research purposes. As a first thing, I would like to underline the importance of both trust and transparency in scientific research, because starting from this point, we can understand why we're talking about which kind of consent model do we need to use in order to perform scientific research. Indeed, of course, in order for us to perform scientific research, we need patients to participate and so provide samples and data or themselves. And it has been shown that participation is enhanced through an increased transparency in the information that we provide to patients. So the more information we give to patients and the more these information are clear, the more people in general are willing to participate in scientific research for any purposes. And so increase the trusts of people in general and of patients in the scientific research field is very important. To keep the scientific research going in a sense, and we can do that by choosing the appropriate consent model when we start thinking about performing any scientific research project in the healthcare sector. Especially, we have to talk about two different models for consent, or like two different types of consent. The first type is the informed consent that we have to ask patient before we can enroll them in any scientific program in the healthcare sector or clinical trial. The second type of consent is the consent to data processing. So the consent that we need to have in order to lawfully process health data for scientific research purposes. On the one hand, informed consent is something that is prescribed by international conventions and declarations, such as, for example, the Oviedo Convention and also the Declaration of Helsinki, in order to respect the autonomy, self-determination, personal integrity, and human dignity of the participants involved. So in general, their rights, and especially their rights to self-determination. More specifically, for example, the clinical trial regulation asks any scientific research project to obtain the informed consent of the future participants. And the characteristics of this consent and the information that we shall give to patients before enrolling them in a clinical trial project are described kind of specifically in Article 29. More in general, it has been said in many documents on a European and international level that this research-related information that we have to give patients shall be presented in order to enable them to voluntarily decide whether or not to participate as a research subject in a scientific research project. So we need to actually explain them what we are going to do, what are the side effects, the pros and cons of participating in order for them to be informed of the pros and cons and then decide if they're willing to participate freely. And moreover, it has been defined as a measure to protect, to ensure the protection of the rights to human dignity and the rights to integrity of individuals under Article 1 and 3 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So it's a measure, as a general measure, to protect the fundamental rights of the people involved in any scientific research project. On the other hand, consent for data processing is required by the GDPR, so the Regulation on Data Protection, whose aim is most importantly to protect the fundamental rights and freedom of natural persons, in particular their rights to the protection of personal data, so the right to privacy. And it establishes rules related to the processing of personal data in general, and in particular Article 5, among the general principles that we have to follow in order to process health data according to the regulation, lists lawfulness. And in order for data processing to be lawful, we need to find a legal basis, and the legal basis that we choose has to be one of those listed in Article 6. However, when we process health data, which are special categories of personal data, and this is the case when we perform a scientific research project in general, there is a general prohibition to process this kind of data because they're considered particularly sensitive. And this general prohibition is included in Article 9.1. But then in the second paragraph, the GDPR lists some exemptions that may be applied in the specific context that we are looking into, in the specific processing that we need to perform. So for example, since we are talking about consent, which is one of the main legal bases actually, we can decide when we want to process health data that we want to ask consent to patients. And in this case, this will be the legal basis according to Article 9, and then the exemption that we use as listed in the first letter of the second paragraph of Article 9. The same GDPR then lists the characteristics of this consent that we need to respect if we want the consent to be correct. It has to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. And when we talk about health data, it also has to be explicit. So if we want this consent to be one of the exemptions that the GDPR provides, it has to be explicit, and so we're used as a justification for the processing of special categories of data. So like we can now underline that these two consents are very different from one another. The informed consent is an ethical and a procedural obligation and is a measure to ensure the protection of the individual's fundamental rights. Is the main condition to include a person into a clinical trial or a scientific research project or activity. And it can also be, and it actually is, a safeguard for data processing according to the European Commission. But it's the consent that the future patient needs to give to participate in a research project or a clinical trial. The consent to data processing, on the other hand, is the legal ground for processing of personal data according to Article 6 and 9 of the GDPR, and it's a measure for the protection of an individual's personal information. It's also an instrument for data processing compliance, so in order to ensure that our processing is lawful. And the requirements for it to be correct, and that's correctly given, is that it has to be freely given, specific, informed, unambiguous, and most importantly, explicit when it comes to the processing of health data. So these two consents shall not be confused. And the clinical practice, actually, most of the time, it's just one module that asks for both consents to the patient in order for them to participate. It doesn't underline the differences between them. And usually that consent does not underline the specific requirements that are needed for the GDPR consent. Actually, most of the time they shall be two different paper, for example, if you want to give a paper consent. So going deeply into the GDPR consent, let's say, so the data processing consent, we actually have three main general models. The first one and the most used one, let's say normal one, is the specific consent. So we give a one-time paper written consent to the patient in order for them to sign it. And it's related to only one specific research purpose and one specific research project. It's not always possible to specify, however, the purposes of the specific research project at the time of collection of the data. This is because of the dynamic nature of the research and the scientific research system overall. So considering the difficulties of laying down all the specific purposes and also the fact that then every time we find a new purpose, we would need to ask the patient for a new consent, two other models have been defined. One is a broad consent model and the other one is the dynamic consent. The broad consent is a consent given to a framework of future research of certain types. So it's not given to a specific and to every specific research project, but it's given to like a more general framework of projects. And then we need to ask patients to give their consent again, only if this general framework changes. According to recital 33 of the GDPR, data subjects should be allowed to give their consent to certain areas of scientific research. So in general and in principle, this kind of consent is allowed. And also this consent might be given to certain areas of research or part of research projects to the extent allowed by the intended purpose. So theoretically, broad consent is allowed by the GDPR. On the other hand, another type of consent is the dynamic consent. So it's when we use an online consent models and communication platforms in order to create a two-way ongoing communication between researchers and research participants, so that we can provide them the information they need to be constantly informed on how we are using their data, and we can kind of on time ask their new consent if it's needed according to the research purposes that we are pursuing. In this case, it's possible to use different types of consent for different research objectives and contexts, because since it's an ongoing communication, we can adjust the type of consent we're asking and the type of consent we are giving to the patient. We're asking the patient to give according to the purposes that we are pursuing. However, when it comes to work consent, the 29 Working Party Guidelines on Consent said that the recital 33 has to be interpreted narrowly, so that the description of research projects on a more general level are only allowed if they cannot be specified at the outset. Because there might be the consent given to a broad range of purposes might not be actually informed. And moreover, that the data controller shall provide subsequent information on the research project as soon as these information are available. So this guideline actually de facto eliminates one of the main advantages of the consent model, because if I have to get back to the patient every time I have new information on the research project, I'm actually eliminating the only reason basically why I was using a broad consent model, so that I didn't need to go back to the patient every time. On the other hand, in the dynamic consent model, it has been underlined that we might give the information to the patient too many information, because by enabling an ongoing communication, we are giving the patient a lot of information, usually in a short period of time, and they might not be able to perform, to understand truly what this information means and what are the consequences of the consent they are given. So again, this specific model of consent might not be completely informed. This is a list of basically pros and cons of the two consent models. The broad consent is a consent for a broad range of research activities. We do not need to recontact the patients, and it's more in favor of scientific research. On the other hand, might not be completely informed, because we cannot foresee all the future characteristics of every research project at the beginning. And the guidelines of the Article 29 Working Party restricted the possibility to use this kind of consent. And on the other hand, the dynamic consent model enables an ongoing communication between patient and researchers. It does comply with the GDPR, and it's possible to use it to enhance trust of patients, because it has been proved that when scientific research in general is open to the patient, they are more willing to participate and they trust it more, and especially their results. But on the other hand, the amount of information that we're giving to patients might be too much. So they might actually not understand everything we are telling them. And there is the problem related to digital trust. So not every time, at all the time, patients trust something that is completely digital. So they might not trust the information that we are giving them, or the method that we are giving this information with. And most importantly, actually, on a practical side, on a complete practical side, in implementing a dynamic consent model can be very, very expensive. I'm personally studying biobanks, and I've been talking to like some biobanks lately, and they've all told me that we would love to implement a dynamic consent model, but it would cost too much. It would be almost impossible to, at the first, as a first step, implement it and then keep it in line with all the regulation, and then actually going and managing all the type of consent at the same time. So the main suggestion here is to use a case-by-case approach. So understand if we want to use the data for a specific research purpose, then we may ask for a specific consent, because we do not need to recontact the patient very often, or we do not need to change the research project purposes very much. On the other hand, if we have a lot of fundings, for example, we can go for a dynamic consent models and then implement also maybe an artificial intelligence system and a specific platform to do this. Otherwise, if we want to go into the broad consent model, let's say, we need to face the need to anyway recontact the patients every now and then whenever our needs as researchers, let's say, change. Thank you all very much for your attention. And if I can, I will answer to your question.